This video is going to talk you through the William Wordsworth poem, The Prelude. So you should have your green poetry anthologies to hand, and you should have turned to a copy of the poem. Okay, so step one, you always read the poem through. We recommend that you read the poem 2 or 3 times, particularly these more difficult poems, which you can tell by the language already in the poem. Okay, so the prelude. And in the frosty season, when the sun was set, and visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed. I heeded not the summons. Happy time it was, indeed, for all of us. To me it was a time of rapture. Clear and loud the village clock tolled 6. I wheeled about, proud and exulting, like an untired horse that cares not for his home. All shod with steel, we hissed along the polished ice in games confederate, imitative of the chase and woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, the pack loud bellowing, and the hunted hare. So through the darkness and the cold we flew, and not a voice was idle. With the din, meanwhile the precipice rang aloud, the leafless trees and every icy crag tinkled like iron, while the distant hills into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed, while the stars eastward were sparkling clear, and in the west the orange sky of evening died away. For this stage, then, make sure that you have drawn your 3 boxes with a ruler at the bottom of the poem. The first box needs to be titled Summary, the second box Context, and then the final box Structure and Form. So step 2, bullet point these contextual notes into the context box. So William Wordsworth was born in the Lake District, so that is up north. And consequently, this exposure to kind of real nature heavily influenced his writing. Wordsworth was also a key contributor towards the Romantic movement. And remember, the Romantic movement was the change in the way that people thought and a change in the way that they viewed the world. So Romantic poets were appreciative of nature, of the arts generally, and beauty. And we see this romantic element of William Wordsworth through the poem as he embodies beauty and nature within the poem. And finally, an important thing to be aware of is that the prelude in our anthology is an extract from a much longer poem called The Prelude. So the snippet of text we're dealing with is an extract from a much longer poem. Step 3, in your summary box, bullet point the information on the slide so that you've got an understanding of the story of the poem prior to your analysis. So the Prelude, as said, is a much longer poem which explores Wordsworth's spiritual growth. It's also autobiographical, which means that he wrote from experience. In this part of the poem particularly, he recounts a childhood experience of skating on a frozen lake at twilight. So it's based on a real-life childhood memory. The imagery in the poem is really vivid, it's really clear as he encapsulates the significance of this particular moment in his lifetime to him. And in the poem, he finds himself alone with nature, and he's able to understand and develop his spirituality. He begins to understand the inevitability of losing childhood innocence and youth, and this is evident in the final line of the poem, that the sky of evening died away. Okay, so we'll start analysing the poem. The first line, and in the frosty season, when the sun was set. So the poem begins with this really rich imagery of the time of his past experience that he's referring to. So it's really vivid, really distinctive, and that kind of highlights how important and how poignant this memory was to him as a child. Naturally, as human beings, we forget, we repress a lot of our memories, a lot of our experiences. However, when a moment is particularly important to us or particularly significant, we are more likely to not only remember it and understand it, but also to recall the real finer details, such as colour and the way we felt. It also establishes the time of the year that the poem is written, so it's a frosty season, which therefore establishes that the poem was written about a time in winter, likely to be December. We learn that the sun was set and that visible for many a mile, the cottage windows through the twilight blazed. So we have the image created here of it being really cold, and from a distance, the speaker, Wordsworth, can see the cottage that he lived in as a child, and through the windows of the cottage he can see this bright light. So again, the really vivid, strong memory there reinforces exactly how special this moment was to him. These lines as well, with the cottage window and the twilight blazing, also reminds Wordsworth that whilst he is outside of his home, and we'll learn that he's ice skating, he's having a nice experience, that the reference to the cottage window shows that he knows that home is always there. He knows that he's going to have to go back home. This positive memory, this positive moment in his life is going to come to an end. And the cottage there, that noun, is that constant reminder of that. Moving on then, Wordsworth describes the time as a really happy one. So you can see in these lines, he says, a happy time it was indeed for all of us. So we learn here that he wasn't alone in this particular memory. We can infer through the collective use of us that he may have been with family, he may have been with friends, but he certainly wasn't alone. Although he says it was a happy time for everybody, he then kind of focuses on what the time and what that moment meant to him. And he says, to me, it was a time of rapture. So this abstract noun, rapture, that just means this really overwhelming sense of happiness. So he's separating himself here from the others, and he acknowledges that yes, they were happy, but to him, in this time, it was this really fantastic moment that he will never forget. Arguably, he feels more happy about this time than the others. So he really remembers that quite vividly. He then also remembers and refers to the imagery, the sensory imagery as well, of the clear and loud the village clock tolled. So if you imagine him, he's out with his friends or family, he can see his home from a distance, and then in the background, he can hear the tolling of the clock making that sound. So the clock striking here creates quite an ominous tone. It's a reminder that the evening and the experience, this really happy time for Wordsworth, is going to come to an end. So that repetition there of the clock making the sound is that constant reminder that he knows it's going to close. Wordsworth then moves on to the quite dynamic description of of him and his friends or family ice skating. So he says, I wheeled about, proud and exulting, like an untired horse. The simile here describes him skating like an untired horse. So it's a really energetic, lively simile, showing how free that they feel. They feel liberated. They feel on top of the world. There's nothing stopping them. There are no restrictions. So this kind of figurative language of them ice skating, there are no boundaries. They're just skating away, minding their own business, and they're really embracing their freedom and their lives. That reference to the ice skating is then continued when he says, we hissed along the polished ice. So we've got this lovely sibilance there, the hissed along the polished ice in Games Confederate. So that repetition of the S sound emulates the sound of ice skating. So if you've been ice skating before, you can almost hear the blade against the ice. And that is where that sibilance there is really powerful, because it's really portraying that sound that he could hear to the reader through the sibilance. Once again, just the description here, hissing along the polished ice in Games Confederate, really reinforces the energy and the speed of the children whilst ice skating and playing together. And obviously we get this sense of togetherness in the phrase Games Confederate, because they're joining up together. Okay, so as the poem continues, we have the reference of the kind of environment really that they are skating in, that they are playing out in. We have reference to the woodland pleasures, the resounding horn, and then Wordsworth says, the pack loud bellowing and the hunted hare. Now this language is quite animalistic, so he's describing himself and the people that he's with, he's describing them as a pack, which is obviously a word that we would use to describe a group of animals. So the self-referential animalistic language shows his fondness of the memory with the particular friends, and the pack isn't necessarily negative, it's more about them being free again. So it's like they're working together, they're enjoying their time together, they're a collaborative group. And we do get this sense of them being really liberal in their actions and liberal in their enjoyment. Like animals, they will do what they wish, they will hunt, they will be free. And that's exactly the image we get here. And then finally, again, we have the reference to their skating. So through the darkness and the cold, we flew. So again, that personification there of them flying through the cold just once again foregrounds their freedom and their happiness. They're flying almost through the sky. There are no restrictions, no boundaries to this particular moment. And then he describes that not a voice was idle. So the sensory language here echoes the image of them being like a wolf pack. So whilst they are howling, shouting, screaming even, and really immersing themselves fully with nature, Wordsworth is highlighting that they weren't making normal sounds, they weren't making normal voices. No voice was quiet. Instead, it was this flying, this loud pack bellowing. So you have the juxtaposition there of sound. They're not being quiet. They're not being careful of what they say. They are free. They are really living life to the max. And then moving on through the poem, as we begin to come to the end and the close of the poem, we do have a change of tone. So we've gone from this really kind of lively imagery emphasizing the freedom of the children, and then the tone just starts to shift. So Wordsworth describes the leafless trees. So if you think about trees as an image, these particular trees are leafless. So that's quite sad. It has connotations of them being quite bare, quite naked, and that suggests or foreshadows the fact that the children will at some point lose that childhood. They too will feel bare once their childhood and their innocence disappears. And then again, this much more sad tone continues. And we have reference to the distant hills. So again, that the language of the distant shows that things aren't quite close to them. And into the tumult sent an alien sound of melancholy, not unnoticed. So The negative shift in tone is continued as Wordsworth discusses the unusual alien sound of sadness and despair that is present during their experience. So it's almost as if whilst they are having fun in their own little bubble, if you like, their background, their environment, they are very aware of this much more negative space or world around them. The enjambment physically demonstrates the sound approaching them as well. So this alien sound is this symbol of things coming to an end, this negativity. They cannot escape the reality that this freedom and joy will not last forever. And then finally, concluding the poem, we have some really lovely images created here while the stars eastward were sparkling clear. So all in all, that's quite a positive line. It's quite a positive image created. And Wordsworth uses this positive metaphor of the stars to symbolise the children, so Wordsworth and his friends, and their current state of mind. So the joy and beauty of the experience. So we have the reference to the stars eastward, sparkling, clear. They seem really bright. They seem really magical almost. However, that is then contrasted with the image in the west. So we have two opposites, the east versus the west. And in the west, the orange sky of evening died away. So the pathetic fallacy here closing the poem really does contrast with this sparkly, magical imagery above, representing the children's feelings at this particular time. Instead, with the orange sky of evening dying, that is a reminder that they cannot escape the inevitable. They are going to have to grow up. They are going to have to change. And in this instance, literally speaking, their memory and that particular time in their life is going to end. They are going to have to go back home to that cottage because that moment will come to a close. But metaphorically, remember that orange sky of evening died away is a reminder that childhood happiness, childhood freedom will inevitably disappear as people grow up. Step 5 then, so bullet point your notes into the structure and form box. So the form, it's a narrative autobiographical poem and it outlines how poignant this memory is to him. So the fact that it is written like a narrative shows us how he is just writing his feelings and there's kind of no boundaries or restrictions to that memory. It also kind of suggests the epiphany he has when being confronted with nature and understanding the inevitability of growth. The enjambment in the poem shows the progression of this particular evening that he speaks about. So the enjambment, that continuation, shows again that continuation of time and also the gradual spiritual growth that he's experiencing. So lots of enjambment, and that just represents change and growth and development. And then finally, the use of caesura, that cares not for his home or shod with steel, demonstrates the real rebellion and freedom that he craved as a child, which naturally we know will come to an end. Okay, so that concludes your lesson on the Prelude. Do feel free to go back and pause parts of the video to add or develop your notes. But that's quite a difficult poem, so well done if you've managed to get the majority of that down.